Stand up.
Well, hello and happy Friday. If you're listening on Friday the 19th of April, I am Pete Dominic. This is Stand Up, where every day I post a new episode of the podcast where I'm talking to someone real smart who's also usually pretty good at talking. And that is no exception today when Dr. Jason Johnson is back joining us. And last night he was filling in for Joy Reid on MSNBC. And during the day he teaches at a historically black university called Morgan State University. And my conversation with Jason begins at 10 minutes after today's headlines. But I do have your headlines this morning. No audio because I want to get this up and out and it would take a long time. But I was up late hanging out with you, many of you. I think it was like 50 people at the party last night. And if you missed it, you can look for the link to relive it all in the subscriber email. But right now, let's get to those headlines for your Friday, April 19th, 2024. We've got to start with the latest on the disgraced former president's trial in Manhattan. Well, the jury has been seated in at least one alternate. Today, they will continue the final day of jury selection, I think. Well, maybe not the final day, but in his election interference trial in Manhattan yesterday, Heather Cox Richardson says Judge Juan Merchan this morning dismissed one of the selected jurors after she expressed concern for her anonymity and thus for her safety. All of the reporters in the courtroom have shared so much information about the jurors that they seemed at risk of being identified. But Fox News Channel host Jesse Waters not only ran a video segment about a juror, he suggested she was, quote, concerning. Trump shared the video on social media. The juror told the judge that so much information had become public about her that her friends and family began to ask her if she was one of the jurors. Legal analyst Joyce Weiss Vance noted jurors' fear for their safety was a concern normally only seen in a case involving violent organized crime. But, you know, that's basically what Donald Trump is, a violent organized criminal. Don't think he ain't, you know, the January 6th insurrection. Cox Richardson writes, nonetheless, by the end of the day, 12 people have been chosen to serve as jurors. Today, the process will continue in order to find 6 alternate jurors. An article in the New York Times today confirmed that the trial will give Trump plenty of publicity, but not the kind he prefers. Lawyer Norm Eisen walked through questions about what a prison sentence for Trump could look like. Trump's popular image has taken a hit in other ways as well. Zach Anderson and Aaron Mansfield, USA Today, reported that Trump is funneling money from his campaign fundraising directly into his businesses. According to a new report filed with the Federal Election Commission, February and March, the campaign wrote checks totaling $411,000, $287 to Mar-a-Lago and in March, a check for $62,000 to Trump National Doral in Miami. Experts say it's legal for candidates to pay their own businesses for services used by the campaign, so long as they pay fair market value. At the same time, they note that since Trump appears to be desperate for money, it looks pretty bad. All right, enough about that loser. Let's move on to another loser. Well, a whole bunch of them. It's Republicans in the House of Representatives who are just absolutely chaotic. House Republicans now privately urging the Speaker, Mike Johnson, to change the rules in the House to raise the threshold required to trigger the procedure to oust the Speaker, because the last guy, a man who is shaped an axe dumber than a hammer, Kevin McCarthy, created a situation where only one Republican or House member could stand up to demand that the Speaker step down. So now they want to change that rule, but now doing so would allow Mike Johnson, who shares an accountability on porn app with his son, to pass the $95 billion foreign aid package and still keep his job over the opposition from the House Freedom Caucus and other conservatives. Christian nationalist Mike Johnson, however, opted against the rule change, saying lowering the threshold for introducing a motion to vacate has, quote, harmed this office and our majority. House Democrats, on the other hand, have signaled they'd provide the votes to overcome a planned blockade by conservatives to pass the stalled aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. However, if Republicans add political amendments or measures that weaken the bill, Democrats won't provide the votes. Meanwhile, this is where it gets really crazy. Person who seems like she's really honestly never read a book, and Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia embarrassed herself again by waking up and then wasting everyone's time by repeatedly proposing absurd and juvenile amendments to the foreign aid package just to slow it down and gum it up. But including, this is real, she included amendments like space laser technology for the southern border, requiring lawmakers voting for Ukraine to conscript into the Ukrainian military, redirecting Ukraine aid to deport undocumented undocumented migrants, prohibiting aid for Ukraine unless the country bans abortion, and offsetting the cost of aid to Ukraine with the salaries of lawmakers who support it. And in response, Florida Democrat Jared Moskowitz was having none of it, so he proposed renaming Marjorie Taylor Greene's office in the House the Neville Chamberlain Room. You know, of course, the former British Prime Minister known for his policy of appeasement toward Adolf Hitler. He also suggested naming Marjorie Taylor Greene Vladimir Putin's special envoy to the United States. Whew, wow, that actually happened. The House is expected to hold a series of votes this weekend, tomorrow, Saturday, on the aid package, with the Senate taking it up next week, so watch for that news over the weekend. Well, the Biden administration imposed new sanctions on Iran's drone, steel, and auto industries in response to its missile attack on Israel. The new package is designed to degrade and disrupt Iran's drone production. The British wanted to get in on the action. The UK also announced sanctions against Iranian military figures and organizations. And the European Union said they would increase sanctions against Iran. Tehran, for its own self, meanwhile, said, "We hold the Americans and messages clearly. To punish Israel was definite and final." That's my new Iranian accent. They added that they're not looking to further escalate in the region. Well, guess what? The Israelis are. And yesterday, they responded. Multiple news outlets reporting late Thursday night that an apparently limited strike took place in central Iran. Israeli officials said Iran said there was no significant damage, but Israel did carry out an airstrike in Iran this morning in retaliation for an Iranian attack against Israel last week. President Biden urged Israel not to strike back. I guess they ignored him, but it was a little strike. We just let you know that we're not done here. That's my Israeli guy accent. I hope nobody's offended. Anyway, in a related story, more than 100 people were arrested yesterday at Columbia University in a protest against Israel's war in Gaza. What else do I have for you in headlines? Yesterday, the Biden administration set new rules to protect transgender students and abuse survivors. The rules bar schools from discriminating against trans students and order changes to how colleges deal with claims of sexual harassment and assault on campus. Here's another story. The U.S. changed how it manages a tenth of its land. A rule released yesterday will allow 245 million public acres of property to be leased for conservation in the same way that oil companies lease land for drilling. This rule, alongside new limits to oil drilling across 13 million acres of Alaska, will help to protect public lands from climate change and development. Oh, and speaking of the planet, apparently, we're experiencing a sudden and extraordinary temperature surge. Al Gore told us the planet had a fever almost 20 years ago now, but each of the past 10 months has been the hottest of its kind. The trend has been driven by decades of uncontrolled fossil fuel burning and an El Nino climate pattern. According to scientists, whether our climate has undergone a fundamental shift or the end of El Nino would bring cooler temperatures remains to be seen. The next few months could provide the answer. All right, two more. Apparently, Prince Harry has officially become a U.S. resident, and Taylor Swift released a surprise double album early this morning called The Tortured Poets Department. She dropped it at midnight, then shocked fans 2 hours later with 15 more songs. Deeply personal album about heartbreak featuring Post Malone in the first single. How about that? All right, well, those are your headlines for Friday. That is what I've got for you. I cannot do it without your paid subscription. Please sign up at patreon.com/Pete Dominic. And just a heads up, next week, I'm going to be all over the place traveling for a special project and excited to tell you all about it very soon. I do plan to post new interviews each day with an opening headline segment, but I may not be able to get to the audio because that requires a lot more time. Helpful to be in my studio with my mixer and all my buttons and keys and computers to do the news segment. And I also won't be hosting the Hangout on Thursday night, but I may be doing it Friday. So stay tuned for more information. Just a heads up, next week will be just potentially a little jilted because of a special assignment that I'm on that you'll soon learn all about, folks. Very exciting. All right. Well, now let's get to my guest today. It's Dr. Jason Johnson, back by popular demand, mainly my mom, who's a big fan. I haven't seen Jason lately. He's a professor at the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University. He's a contributor to MSNBC, where you can see him regularly and even anchoring the shows. He's a contributor to the Grio, and he's the host of a very, very good podcast in terms of his interviews that he does. His guests are so interesting, and I learned so much from a word on Slate. I think his most recent episode is with the great Michael Harriot, always so great. He is, of course, a PhD, a real smart guy, a total nerd, and a very, very good, close personal friend of mine. Very happy to have him back on the show. I think you'll love today's conversation. Let's do it right now with Dr. Jason Johnson. Jason Johnson is the guy. Jason Johnson, Jason Johnson, Jason Johnson, that's the guy.
Good morning, Mr. Dominic. How are you?
Jason Johnson song, everybody.
I have my own song now. That's amazing.
Well, you do. You heard it before.
I always assumed my song would be "Time for Some Action" by Redman, what they used to play with like boxers when they would enter the ring.
Dr. Jason Johnson keeps.
Oh yes, this is the song that was made for me by Nick. Yes.
All his thoughts on everything from politics to Comic-Con, and he seems like such a nice guy. And I think you all understand why you should devour every lesson served at his verbal delicatessen. Dr. Jason Johnson keeps on talking on and on and on and on. Yeah.
I need you to send me this song as an MP3. So when I promote the podcast and my podcast, I can play this and draw people back to it. I love that. I love that I have my own theme music and it's not a rap song.
I literally just emailed it to you. Do you need to tell me anything before I hit record? I mean, I'm already recording. Was there a specific thing that you wanted to discuss today?
Oh, all sorts of things. I want to talk about what's happening in politics in this country. I want to talk about what's happening in sports in this country. I want to ask you some questions about that. I want to talk about my upcoming podcast. There's all sorts of things. I have a good, healthy, 30 minutes or so before I have to get into I got a staff meeting this morning because I'm sitting in for Joy.
I'll get you out by 10:30. Here we go. Jason Johnson, what is happening well, first of all, I just have to say my mom asked me, and I sent you the video. I made her make a video. She goes, I haven't heard from Jason Johnson on the podcast. You know, he's one of my favorites. Is everything okay? And I sent you the video of mom saying that. She's a big fan. Say hi to Mary Dominic.
Hi, Mary Dominic. And look, I was very touched. I was very moved. Moms are an important part of our relationship in this show. And literally as I was exchanging this morning, little personal information, my mom and I share our blood pressure readings in the morning to make sure that we're taking care of our health and everything else like that. So I literally was sharing my blood pressure reading with my mom. And I was like, hey, I'm about to go on Pete. And she's like, tell Pete hi. So, yeah.
Mama Jerry Johnson. My mom and I do something similar. I press on my gums to see if any blood comes out with the gingivitis, and then I send her a JPEG.
Yeah, no. My mom is always sort of taking care of her health and her fitness.
Great. Awesome.
She was leaving the gym. She's got lower blood pressure than me, which, I mean, part of that, I guess, can be retirement, and part of it is she's, probably eating better than I do. So. You got to work.
All right. Well, we've got moms in our lives that mean so much to us and raise us to be the men that we are, which are good men. We're good men. You're a good man. I'm a good man, whatever that means. There's a lot of bad men. This is my stupid segue in Congress. And I know there's a lot happening in politics, but I wonder which of the issues from what's happening in Congress, the courts, or the presidential campaign that you want to tackle first, or take them all.
The presidential campaign and the elections are the most important for me because we only have but so much influence over what's happening in Congress. I think it's very important to note that Joe Biden's numbers are actually improving. Nobody ever wants to talk about that, but overall his polling numbers seem to be improving. You don't have to like Joe Biden. Lots of people don't like Joe Biden. But we have two choices. It is either Joe Biden, who you may not like, or Donald Trump, who is a multiple times indicted, impeached criminal who wants to turn this country into a dictatorship. So if you have any issues with dictatorship, it's pretty obvious who you should vote for. But what's been of particular notice is I spent some time in Georgia recently and talked to people who are very sort of politically connected down there. And it's all the more important to take into consideration this election is going to be close. We haven't had a not close election in this country. I think there's only been one election in this country that wasn't close in the last 16, 17 years. I mean, like Obama beating McCain and Obama beating Romney. Those are fairly predictable. He was the incumbent president. He seemed to be doing well. Romney was sort of caught at 47%. But, 2016 and 2020 and 2022, all of these recent elections are very close. And I have it on fairly good authority that Joe Biden is probably not going to win Georgia this time. He doesn't have to win Georgia.
Really?
But if he doesn't, then Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin become all the more important. And, there's enough time to turn these things around. But if we really actually report on what's happening on the ground in these states, there's still a lot of work to be done. And I don't know that the Biden administration completely understands that.
Why are you sleeping on Georgia? I thought they created quite an operation over the last several elections and were turning more blue, more purple.
So this is the trick. This is the thing that you have to understand. And this is a thing. I knew this already. If you look at, say, a presidential campaign, right? Sometimes we have presidents who are good strategists and organizers. And sometimes you have presidents who just know how to win elections, right? But winning an election and organizing your electorate so you can win the election are two different jobs, right? There's some members of Congress where it's like, this woman is like, hey, I used to organize. I used to be a school teacher. I used to be a union member. I know how to get people out. I know how to get people involved, blah, 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 strategy, et cetera, et cetera. And I know how to be a good candidate. Some people are just good candidates. Some people are just good organizers. What you have in Georgia right now is a bit of a leadership vacuum. Stacey Abrams is not on the ballot. The leadership in the state is the people who turned Georgia purple and bluish over the last decade are no longer the people really running things down there. And the people who are running things down there, like the two most prominent Democrats in the state, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, they're candidates. They're not organizers. They don't have infrastructure. And with the leadership of a lot of the organizations no longer being in positions of power, the kind of people that you need organized on the ground to get things done, they're not there anymore.
All right, let's leave Georgia. What are your other views of the presidential campaign and what's left? Obviously, one of the most important points people are making is that Joe Biden's out campaigning. This week he's in Pennsylvania, he's making a bunch of stops. He's doing the campaign thing, the traditional thing. He looks like he's got enough energy. He probably is getting a nap in at some point during the day, unlike his opponent who's napping in court and not campaigning. And obviously some people say that him being in court helps him raise money and helps him create a certain image of being persecuted and being a martyr and so on. But what do you make of is this an important, I feel like it's a pretty important point. It's an obvious point. One guy's campaigning, the other guy's on trial.
Well, you know what, Pete, that would matter if anybody didn't know who these guys are.
Fair enough.
I mean, we got like two incumbents running against each other. Nobody in this country, which is why this is about what your field team is and everything else like that. Nobody in this country doesn't know how they feel about Joe Biden or Donald Trump.
I'm sorry to jump in, but what if Trump gets found guilty? What if he does get found guilty in a criminal trial for this case and it's in the news every day? That can't be helpful to be reminded of who he is, though.
It's not going to change anybody's mind.
How dare you?
I mean, that's the thing, Pete. Like even when I see these polls where it's like, well, I kind of vote for Trump, but if he gets convicted, give me a break.
Right.
Give me a break. Now, I mean, we just saw this with John Sununu, who was like, I endorse Nikki Haley, and then he flips and he supports Trump. None of these people have any backbone.
Isn't that Chris Sununu?
Chris Sununu, yeah.
How dare you? He was fantastic on that show. Oh, he really let you know who he is.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah. There you go. And that's what, and so that's what a lot of this election is going to be about. It's people already being honest about who they are and where they are and whether they're going to turn out to vote one way or another. I generally, as of right now, as of mid-April, I am of the opinion that Joe Biden wins re-election by a very, very small margin. That's my guess right now. If circumstances, polling, stuff on the ground changes, then I'll change my mind. But it's going to take a lot of work. And we still have to be very honest about the possibilities of terrorist attacks on voting places, on voters themselves, on organizers. We've been seeing that happening since the rise of the MAGA movement. And I'm really big on this. And I'm glad you asked me this question about the election. I really think elections, from mayors to local prosecutors to state houses and stuff like that, that is the job of the press. That is something we should be taking care of, because and I say this in all sincerity, as important as Trump's trial in New York is, and it is important, you have a party nominee under investigation for massive fraud and violation of state rules and federal rules and everything else like that. It is a passive experience for the audience, right? It's passive. I can watch the trial. I can't affect the trial at all. But when we report on things that the audience can involve themselves in, hey, this election is happening in this state. So people in that state, you can do this, you can do that, you can sign up, you can volunteer, you can this, that, the other. I think we always have to have a balance of that. We got to tell people about the things that they can affect and not just have them sort of gawk at things that they can only passively afford.
Yes, and by the way, get out there. My school board election is May 21st. So there's things happening right now that you can affect a huge deal, just sometimes hundreds, if not a few thousand people voting in these elections. So yeah, get local. Of course, I'm glad that you said that.
And I also want to talk a little bit about this, what we've been seeing with Colombia, the president of Colombia being dragged down to Congress to testify or whatever. These attacks.
Columbia University in New York City, the president was brought in to Congress to why do they accept these invitations? They don't have to go, right? But the Columbia president was grilled over campus anti-Semitism is one headline. So in case people don't know, go ahead.
Well, and here's the thing about that. It's like these are bad faith hearings. I mean, that's the thing. Like,
right.
These are
that's
not
what I'm
members
saying.
of Congress
Why
who really
go?
care.
Why go to a bad faith hearing?
Well, you end up having to go for one of two reasons, or possibly two of two reasons. One, Colombia is the president of Colombia is smart because they blew off these hearings the last time. The hearings that ended up with Claudine Gay, president of Harvard, having to step down. Right. Colombia said, I don't have time for this, and didn't go the last time. This time, it's much less likely to cost anybody their job because the nation's eyes aren't going to be paying attention to, what this hearing is. But I think, look, I'm with you. I would say no, but I suspect there is pressure on the part of donors and alumni at some of these institutions to go to these hearings. And then there's sometimes an arrogance on the part of these administrations that think, well, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to tell Congress what I think and how they know that this is a bunch of bunk. But you can't do that when you're in sort of this media ecosphere where nothing you say is going to be interpreted the way you want. So your best bet is just not go.
Well, they're picking on, this is part of the strategy that the right and some of the architects have specifically got the strategy to go after university presidents, especially the most elite university presidents. Of course, Claudine Gay at Harvard, and then they went after UPenn president, who also I think resigned, and now Columbia. So they're going after the Ivies. But furthermore, I mean, you're an elite professor at an elite university, and the fact of the matter is they want to go after academia in general, higher education, public education, much less private education at the higher level. I mean, what is this? Isn't this part of that strategy, dragging her in? And there it is, Elise Stefanik trying to get another scalp.
Yeah. What you do is, delegitimize, litigate, then legislate, right? I think that's what the strategy is. So what you do is you get the sort of media ecosystem, the right wing, to say this isn't legitimate. This president isn't legitimate. They've done this, they've done that, accusations of things they haven't done. Or you say a program, you call this program DEI, which is just a new version of woke, which is just a new version of PC. Anything that white people who are conservative don't like, they will just call DEI. And so you sort of label this thing over and over again. Then you either threaten a lawsuit or you actually sue. So you take some outside organization, you find some people who will be useful idiots to sue the school or threaten to sue the school. And then if the school does not end the program, fire the professor, remove the university president, et cetera, then you try to put pressure on the legislature to make laws to enforce that. It's not a new tactic.
It's effective.
Yeah, it's effective, but it's also effective if you are not prepared. And a discussion I've been having with a lot of my friends and colleagues is, when I was in graduate school at Chapel Hill and I went to UVA undergrad, those schools' administrations were anticipating the Supreme Court striking down affirmative action. So they were already readjusting their programs. What you have now is the white nationalists in Congress have put so much money behind this that you now have, for example, at Duke University, they had a private scholarship, privately funded scholarship for African-American students that's been there since the 70s, and they've canceled it. And they've canceled it because they're afraid of a lawsuit. And none of this stuff is about fairness or justice. It's all about trying to keep Black people out of institutions of higher education. That's what it's all about. They don't want Black people to get into college. They think that we are inherently unintelligent and undeserving of participating in the American dream. And the only way that these, whether it's Ackerman or any of these other people screaming about DEI, Elon Musk, whatever, the only version of black and brown people that they want in universities is as a sprinkling of flavor or as entertainment in college sports. That's the motivation. Because you never hear anybody talk about, when you're talking about these DEI programs that they hate, which are never defined, or these woke programs which you hate, which are never defined. No one ever talks about, well, isn't it a certain kind of program seeking out minority use when you have, a school in Alabama trying to recruit black kids from Chicago to play for the football team? I mean, no one has a problem with that. But going to recruit black kids from Chicago to just go to the University of Alabama, and suddenly people have a problem with it.
We want our talented black folks to mostly be on the stage, the athletic stage or other, to bring money and attention to our university. But we don't want too many of them interspersed in the student body just doing normal education, normal tracks, but they're
just student stuff. Yeah. And also note that it's always about a chilling effect. It's always about trying to make I keep telling people this. If anybody thinks, it's just like when we talk about abortion. If anybody thinks that Republicans are going to stop with trying to make abortion illegal, you're dumb. They will then go for contraception. They will then go, they're going after IVF. And that goes back to why, again, local elections matter. What does your state house have to say about access to abortion rights? And then federal elections matter, because if you don't vote for the right people, that right will be taken away.
Let's talk about sports. What's on your mind?
I have been highly entertained by two things recently. So I asked you this. And I don't know this, Pete. Did either of your kids, you have one daughter in high school, one who's in college now. I don't think either of your kids played sports, did they?
My older daughter, Ava, did not. My younger daughter, Julia, suddenly started to play sports in 9th grade, volleyball and lacrosse. She's currently on the JV lacrosse team.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Did you ever have a moment where once your younger daughter was interested in sports, did you become like sports girl dad? Like, did you start really, obviously whatever your kid is interested in, you're going to care about, but did you start trying to go to ESPN, the Ocho to watch lacrosse, for field hockey for her? Like, did it change your viewing habits?
A little bit. My viewing habits, maybe a little bit. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I probably watched a little bit. Probably not. I always watch a little lacrosse, men's lacrosse mainly. I still don't really fully understand the women's sport. The women's game's a lot different, the rules and stuff. But I've learned a lot watching her the last 2 years. So not really. Why?
So there's been this whole interesting discussion about the impact of Caitlin Clark specifically, but what's been happening in women's college basketball with the championship of the last 2 weeks. For the first time in recorded history, the women's championship, women's college basketball championship got higher ratings than the men's. The WNBA draft, which was the draft for a lot of these young women athletes, got its highest ratings of all time. It was like 300% over the last year, something crazy about that. And I don't find the discussion of is this sustainable to be that interesting. Look, when people watch sports, they care about sports, whatever. But what's been interesting is this conversation about who is behind this increase in numbers. And the sort of current theory is that it's white dads. And they're, white dads with sports playing daughters who are like, look, my daughter, I'm 40.
Sure.
My daughter is 9.
Yeah.
And like, I can look at Caitlin Clark and I can watch her with my 9-year-old. Right.
Yeah.
And what I've also sort of pointed out in this is that Caitlin Clark, and there are some people obviously who are critical, not of Caitlin Clark, but the fact that she gets this attention. She's got, she's getting a signature shoe by Nike, already. And there are only 3 WNBA players that have signature shoes, and they're all white women, and none of whom are MVPs. Yeah.
How is that possible? That's such an overt oversight. You couldn't. Well, why would they do that? You would think that you would sell plenty of sneakers, any other ethnicity player, huh?
Yeah. So that's the conversation. So there's this whole conversation about like, what is marketability and who is bringing new people to the sport and why do casuals pay attention? And it's been very, I'm fascinated by it because, again, I don't have a kid, right? I don't have a daughter. So my consumption of sports is purely driven by what's interesting to me.
The only thing I don't have a lot to say about it because I haven't thought that much about it. I didn't realize the trends there. I will say I've always enjoyed watching women's soccer, specifically women's skiing and women's tennis. I never really got into women's basketball that much, but I think that what you're seeing to a certain extent is men realizing that they really they have a lot of ambition in being good dads to their kids of any gender. Yep. And those of us who have daughters, we really want to understand what our daughters are into, and we want to do things with them. And I think when it comes to sports, so much has changed even since we were young. And women have gotten so much better. The equipment's gotten better. There's been so much more openness to playing in terms of cultural and then obviously just in terms of funding for it. And it's been platformed. It's been televised. And so, it's just everything about women's sports has gotten better with more opportunity and as culture shifts and supports it. And finally, I think it's totally cool for men to watch women's sports in a lot of ways, even if it's just because we're attracted. I mean, I won't lie. I've always thought women athletes are very attractive. I like strong, athletic women. I used to do a joke in my stand-up act where I just would progressively be more specific to the point where I finally end up. I like men, but no, I like athletic women, and I like watching women play sports, and the ones I mentioned specifically. And I think we're just trying to be better dads to daughters, and that means you enjoy the things that they enjoy. And sports have just gotten so much. Women's sports have gotten so much more accessible and exciting.
Well, I think it's. I don't know if I would say they're more exciting, but I think there's a. You don't
think women's sports have gotten more exciting? Our life?
I don't know that I would say that, because I think that you would have to have, you'd have to be able to say, well, what was more exciting than this? What was more exciting than that? I think what's happened is that women's
soccer, just take that the women's soccer United States team and then the National League has gotten more and more exciting since 1999.
Well, yes, obviously exciting, but
women's
the excitement
tennis
is because we were winning, right? And people decided that they cared.
Women's tennis.
Here's the thing about women's tennis. If you are a tennis person, right? Like my friend Teray, the writer of the podcast, Teray loves tennis, and he's like a tennis historian, right? Teray could say, well, actually, Chris Everett and Jennifer Capriati in 1992 was I'm not enough of a tennis historian that I can tell you amongst tennis fans what's the most exciting. What I can say is that if you are a Gen Xer or a millennial, whether you are a parent or not of a girl or a boy or whatever, your understanding of tennis for the last 15 years has been defined by Venus and Serena. So to you, the idea of the best and most interesting person in a particular sport being a woman isn't strange. Now, if you're 60 years old, you may still be like, I grew up watching John McEnroe, and that's what makes more sense to me. But if you're 42 and you got a 12-year-old, and it's like, going from Venus and Serena, who are now kind of, retired and moving on, to, hey, there's this amazing lady named Caitlin Clark, and I like basketball in general, and I like people who can make spectacular shots. That's not as much of a generational leap. And that's, and you're, again, if you baseline like sports, the issue has always been that there's been a resistance by men to watching women perform in sports.
I think,
but winning helps.
I think the other thing is probably, again, I haven't really thought that much about this, but I'm really glad to be having the conversation. I think it's really enlightening. I think the other thing is we as men, we love sports. If you're a guy who loves sports, you grew up playing sports like I did. I absolutely wanted my daughters to play sports. I got them into soccer and t-ball right away. They both lasted maybe 2 seasons each. I coached it. I was on top of it, but I never pressured them. They went into dance. They spent most of their life in adolescence and young life as dancers exclusively and skiers. So I got that out of them. But my point is, if you're a sports guy and you have daughters, you try to make them sports daughters. There's so much more accessibility and opportunity for youth sports for girls. So now you end up being on the road every weekend. I never wanted to be that dad. Every week you work all week and then you're traveling to fucking Pennsylvania or further. I'm in New York to spend the whole weekend in some shit hotel so your kid can play. No, that's ridiculous, I think. But I know a lot of parents love that. I don't. Yeah. But the point is, you get to be with your daughter doing the thing that you love always loved, which is sports. Now you've made them in your image. I obviously didn't do that, or I lost that. I never fought it really, but I coached. I did everything I could. I role modeled it, but they wanted to dance.
And now we dance. But I think that's a reflection, though. Look, if you're glass half empty or glass half full, I think that's a reflection, though, of a change, as you said, in the culture of fatherdom in this country. Right. The idea that, it's Kobe Bryant and his daughter who passed in the crash. Yeah. But it was like he wasn't making her be, we had this sort of notion.
He kind of was, because he was her father.
Well, yeah.
No, he was. I know what you're saying. Hopefully you're not doing that to your kid. Yeah.
Yeah. And for a long time we had this sort of stereotype myth of the baby boomer father who was like, damn it, I got daughters, I can't love sports.
Yeah, that's gone. Not gone, but it's far less prevalent for sure. Yeah.
It's like, because the guy's like, oh no, I'm going to make an ass of myself at my daughter's soccer game as much as I would at my son's football game.
Yeah,
I'm just happy to see my kid compete.
Yes.
So, there's a level of progress with that, but I think it's this really interesting. And as we've seen some of the sort of sexism and racism in the coverage, we could be going into a really interesting era in this country of also, and I point this out and then I'll spin this into my podcast, but this also interesting cultural era where like our perception of entertainment may change, right? Because again, if you're watching women's basketball, some of your expectations for the entertainment are going to be different. Some of your coverage has to change, which means it can't just be dominated by a bunch of dudes talking about the sport. You're going to have women who used to play basketball. You're going to have women who actually covered basketball, even if they didn't play. Yeah. So the language and the conversation has to change as well. And that's fascinating for me to see.
They hire women like with more male voices, like more timbre. I like the more masculine sounding female commentators. They sound almost like men, continuing my earlier point. People do say, it is funny. You'll see less of this, but sometimes you'll see people complain on Twitter, just asshole men. Like, these women, why don't they shut the hell? They don't know what they're talking about, whatever. And it's usually the case, as like with other things, they actually know a lot more, whether they're referees, coaches, or commentators, than the men, because they had to work so much harder to get there. Not always, but probably usually. And maybe they won't be relegated to sideline reporters. That's always the most overt sexism to me, when there's a bunch of dudes in the booth and then there's just one more attractive lady down on the sideline talking to the asshole coach and whatever. But spin it into your podcast.
Yeah. So it's funny when I was talking about this idea of like we're facing these cultural shifts. So my podcast this week, which I'm super freaking excited about. So have you heard, Pete Dominic, and I know you've heard of this, but I just want to see what your experience is with it. Pete Dominic, have you ever heard of Freaknik?
Yeah. I heard of it in 93. Heard the word over and over and over before I realized what it was, which you want me to describe it as ignorantly as I can?
Yes, please do.
It's a huge party for black people, really exclusively in Atlanta. And it occurs.
There were guards at the end of the city that said white people couldn't come. This is pretty.
Yeah. And so, so I heard about it in college from all the black folks. I don't remember, but I just heard the word over and over. Go ahead.
So, there's this documentary called Freaknik, The Greatest Story Never Told, that dropped about 6 weeks ago on Hulu. And here's the thing. Here's the backstory for this. Freaknik was such a huge party. It was started by students in the AUC, the Atlanta University Center, which is like the 4 or 5 HBCUs that are in downtown. Well, what used to be downtown Atlanta, Morehouse, MLK, when there, all this sort of great things. And what would happen is in the 80s, people who couldn't go home for spring break, because again, if it's 1987, you weren't buying no plane ticket to fly back home to Chicago. You weren't going back to New York. Right. So they start throwing this big annual picnic, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then people from all over the country started coming, and it became like this whole citywide thing. And then the city had to shut it down. It's this whole fascinating story. A lot of entertainers were discovered there. A lot of people met folks. There were citywide shutdowns. It's like, imagine Woodstock happening annually for like 15 years.
Right. Yeah.
And it shut down the city. And so I did an interview for my podcast dropping Friday, A Word with Jason Johnson on Slate, and we talked to the directors and the producers of the podcast. This is the thing that really gets me about it, and why I thought this was like particularly interesting. I had heard about Freaknik. I had heard about the parties. I had heard about all the stuff that people did, but we ended up having this also really interesting conversation about like how partying has changed. and how the kind of crazy stuff that you could do if you were at a college party in the 90s doesn't exist today. Not just because of social media, but because of cameras, fears of STDs, our understanding of what party culture is supposed to be today. It's really interesting.
I'm sure it is for someone who had parties. I don't think I attended a lot of like amazing things. Whatever you're describing, I certainly didn't get in much trouble around sex, drugs, or alcohol. In my 20s, I didn't touch it. I was very focused on my career, and I was always working and blah, blah, blah. But it sounds fascinating, and it's interesting that you compared it to Woodstock, because when you say Woodstock, I think of white people covered in mud. And when you talk about Freaknik, I think of black people covered in cocoa butter. That is exactly what I thought of.
Yes. Cocoa butter and Carl Kanai, overall shorts.
Is Fahrenheit cologne a black thing or just my black roommate thing? And so I thought because he was the only one I was that close to, it was a black thing.
My understanding of Fahrenheit is like, that was one of those colognes that I think people thought smelled a lot better than it really did. And it was also nominally accessible because you could get it at like a Macy's or something. Let me tell you this. When I was in college, and you and I were in college around the same time, it was moving from, and this is very 90s, but it was moving, it was Drakkar Noir. Everybody thought Drakkar was like
was there thing. I'm sorry. Is there not a black versus white male scent? Is there not like a scent like that black men more likely gravitate towards for cultural or any other reason? Does scent smell different on different humans, much less ethnically different skin?
Well, it does. It does. I mean, scents smell different on everybody because so much of what you smell like has to do with what you consume, your body chemistry and everything else like that. Like if you eat a diet of vegetables, you don't smell the same as somebody who
smell terrible. Those people smell terrible.
Vegetable people smell great.
Vegan people who are exclusively plant fat, I believe they smell badly.
They smell wonderful, Pete. They do. But here's the thing. When I was in school, I can't tell you what's a specific black scent because it probably depends on what part of the country that you're in. I know New Yorkers wore one thing, DC. But what I can say is that, like, as we moved into the late 90s and the early 2000s, like body sprays were almost an exclusive white boy frat thing. Like I don't know any black guy,
makes sense.
Who was wearing Axe body spray like that. No, you didn't do it. If you were
interesting.
Black, yeah. You didn't, what's the Old Spice? I can't even whistle the little tune.
I can't either, but yeah.
That, and
well, that was marketed by that brilliant, hilarious black actor in that amazing campaign where I'm a man. What was it?
I'm the man your man's supposed to smell like.
Yeah, he was great.
He was great. It's great. Yeah. He played at Stanford or University of Arizona.
Like, I'm on a horse. Oh, those were so funny. Jason, I know I got to let you go. Yeah. So I guess goodbye unless there's anything else that I have all the time and wanted to mention, but.
I want to tell you this. First off, Pete, I want to remind each and every person that life is long. It's been a very interesting couple of weeks for me, and it has been a reminder as I have seen a number of people in my life deal with transitioning family members, sick family members, and everything else like that. We have a very, very long time on this planet. And so you want to spend it the best way you can. Don't operate from the presumption that life is short. Operate from the presumption that life is long. Spend extra time talking to your mothers, your brothers, your uncles, your sisters, and everything else like that, because these people are going to be here. And a lot of times they may be here and they're not in the best condition. So you want to be able to spend the time you can spend with them because they could be here in not their best form. And you want to do the most you can with that.
Love that. Love that. Thank you for that. And that is a good place to stop. Thank you, sir. All right. There he goes, Dr. Jason Johnson. Find him right now on social media and let him know that you heard him here on the show and thank him for joining me. Also, listen to his podcast on Slate, A Word with Jason Johnson. Watch him on MSNBC. And that is that. That is what I've got for you here on Friday. Look for a Saturday show. I think I've got something cooking for you. Might not. We'll see if I can get it done. I got a gig tonight. I got last week tonight over the weekend, and then I leave Sunday on special project, special correspondent status till Thursday, but I'll be posting shows next week. Just could be without the audio segment of the news, but I'll get it done for you because I appreciate how much you support support me. Go to patreon.com/PeteDominic right now. If you haven't already, you can always pay more for your subscription if you feel like you're getting more than $5 a month. That would be much, much appreciated. And as always, go to johncarroll.org and buy his music because he sings to us each and every day. I will talk to you later. Love you. Peace be with you and upon you, my friends. Bye-bye.
They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. Alright, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.